You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. My guest today is Lyn Hammer. She goes by Mary Lyn. She's a health and wellness advocate, author, and Lyme disease and blood infection survivor. She had a near-death experience from it. It was so bad, from what her bio is saying. It took years of, misdiagnoses, ineffective treatments. So she took control of it, her healing journey herself, and has come to a much better place. She has a book called Over My Dead Body, which details her near-death experience and the methods that saved her life. So welcome, Mary Lyn. Thanks for coming.
Thank you very much. Pleasure being here.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I guess we'll go to the, your history. What happened? How did you contract Lyme and a blood infection? What happened to you?
Well, I got the Lyme infection. I was at a conference in Hilton Head, and I grew up in Montana, so the ticks there, you actually see them like sticking out of your body, so they're very obvious, whereas the ones in Hilton Head, I had a bite on my leg that was there for like 4 months, but I never saw a bug. I didn't have a rash. I didn't have a bullseye. I was in my first trimester of pregnancy, so a lot of the symptoms were masked by, when I was finally diagnosed, the doctors were asking questions like, were you tired? Well, yeah, it was my first month of pregnancy was when I got bit. So of course I was tired. So a lot of the things that happened in the beginning, we thought were related to being pregnant and childbirth. And prior to this, I was a professional dancer and a world-class skier. I was an extreme skier, so I was in extremely good shape. I was used to jumping out of helicopters and jumping off of cliffs and doing all kinds of crazy things. And I was working out and I was getting weaker and weaker and nobody could answer my questions. And I was going from doctor to doctor, and my primary was from Hawaii. So he'd had zero experience with Lyme disease. And they really don't teach about it in medical school. Talk to doctors all over the country, and they've said that they have maybe 2 hours of training about Lyme disease, and that's it. So, it's something that has a lot of very weird symptoms, and the doctors aren't trained to diagnose it. It's kind of like lupus, if you have an experience with that, where a lot of times the diagnosis comes after you have so many of the symptoms in a pattern. And, I kept hearing, well, at your age, and I remember thinking, I just had a baby. I'm not that old. Like, really? And so I just kept looking because I couldn't get answers. And finally, one day I went to a clinic and their intake was 3.5 hours long. And one of the doctors was there filling out personnel paperwork, and he hadn't started work yet. And he asked if he could sit in on my case. And about 20 minutes into the interview, he said, I know what you have, but keep going. And they had an extensive questionnaire, and some of the symptoms I had had for so long, I didn't really think about it, because after I finished answering all these questions, he said, can you feel your feet? And I said, well, no. And he said, how long has it been like that? And I said, like 5 years. And it wasn't that they were completely numb. It was more like a feeling of what they feel like when your feet go to sleep and then they're waking up, like that painful neuropathy, but you can't really feel things. And then he said, do you have a migraine? Do you have a headache? And I said, yes. And he said, how long have you had that? And I said, about 5 years. He said, why didn't you put any of this on your questionnaire? And I said, well, I've just had it for so long, I don't think about it. And, and so we went through this whole conversation like that. And then he said, you have Lyme disease. We can get tests to verify that. When it's later chronic Lyme, the traditional tests become less and less effective. But based on your symptoms, that's what you have. And then he said, do you want to start treatments? And let me tell you that treatments aren't for sissies. And he said, you're going to have days when you can't walk. You'll have days when when you can't talk and you're at days when you just want to die. And he was right. And I was a single mom. Elizabeth was my greatest surprise in life. And so I was a single mom right from the beginning. And my mother was...
Were you pregnant while you had Lyme and all this? But no.
Yeah, I got bit by the tick my first month of pregnancy. And so my
do this protocol during the pregnancy, or was it too dangerous?
No, I wasn't diagnosed for 6.5 years. So
Okay.
my daughter was born with Lyme disease, and I spent years trying to find answers. And then finally we were diagnosed. She was 5 when we were diagnosed.
So it keeps carried through in pregnancy. I didn't know that. Is it worse? Was it worse for her because of that?
No, she actually, my infection was much worse than hers. So there was a level of, filtering going on there. She had cognitive issues and she was very, very tired, a lot of food allergies, which food allergies aren't a Lyme thing. It's more of an immune system thing. Like the weaker your immune system gets, the harder it is to digest certain foods. So people end up having a lot of, these side effects, and food allergies is part of that. So she was allergic to a lot of foods, and it was very challenging, for a small child to have to, back in those days, when we were diagnosed in 2006, and back in those days, gluten-free food, the bread fell apart. I'd send her to school with these sandwiches that would fall apart, and she just wanted to be a normal kid. And I kept her active just because I felt like moving was important. But she was in gymnastics, and she would do an event and then lie down. And so it was really hard on her, and she had a hard time retaining information. She was smart, but it didn't stick with her. And that was the most heartbreaking thing about it is, when you're told that your child is sick like that, it's just such a stinking feeling. And so when he said, "Do you have any children?" And I said, "Yes, I have a daughter." And he said, "How is her health?" And I told him, and he said, "She's got it too. You can get it in utero." And so she literally, I was with the same month I got pregnant. So she literally developed in it and was sick the first 8 years of her life until we got rid of it.
And how's she now? Is she okay?
She's amazing. She still has some cognitive issues, and she's learned to manage them. For the first 3 years after we got rid of the disease, she had to go into tutoring and relearn all of the memorization that happens when kids are in early school, like how to add and subtract and cite words. She had to relearn all of that. And so that took about 3 years because she was in the 2nd grade when we got rid of it. And so she was having to do that training at the same time she was doing the training for the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, and it took real dedication and a lot of patience to get through that with her. But she graduated from college last year with honors, and yeah, she's pretty amazing. And she's been promoted twice already this year. I'm very proud of her. And, but she's had to learn how to manage the cognitive issues.
Okay.
Yeah, though they're not horrible, but so my journey was much more difficult because I ended up getting a blood infection with the IV port that I had for the Lyme treatments. My daughter didn't have to go through all of that, but the blood infection I contracted had a 3% survival rate. And so I'm very, very blessed to be here. And it's also the reason that we found the answers. When the doctor first told me you have Lyme disease, I really didn't know anything about it. I'd heard about it, and I researched things. That's what I do. My business at that point was, and it still is. I've had my business for 35 years. It was in student loans, and I love learning. So I researched everything that the doctors told me I would research. And right before they took the port out, they had figured out I had a blood infection, but they thought if they took me off of antibiotics that I would die. And so they took some blood from me, and it was coming out of my port, and this white stuff went into the tube. And there was 4 doctors in the clinic when it happened, and none of them had ever seen anything like it before. And of course I was being a smart aleck, and hey, if that's fat, can we take some of it in my butt?
Right.
I just kind of joke around about things to lighten it up because it was really freaky. And it like styrofoam. And he said it was a fibrinogen material is what we got back from the lab. And the studies about biofilm at that time were fairly new. I knew that biofilm was tied to Lyme disease, and basically it's a material that the pathogen forms to hide in. And so when you hear people talking about being in remission, it's really that the pathogen is hiding inside that biofilm. So, these are they're considered stealth infections, which means they're highly intelligent. They mutate. Lyme disease has 46 different DNA strands. It mutates into 14 different life forms that I've found. And then it's got all of these co-infections. So it's a very, very complicated disease, and it moves. So you have to, in order to take it out, you have to move with it. But what happens with the biofilm is that when people go on long-term antibiotics, the pathogens will go inside the biofilm to hide. And then they come off of the antibiotic thinking they're in remission. And once the antibiotics are out of the body, it comes back out and starts populating again. So I knew there was a biofilm associated with the Lyme. And then I got the blood infection, and I literally, I crossed over numerous times. I was standing in the tunnel of light, and my brother, I grew up in an abusive home, and my brother died in that home 2 weeks before his 4th birthday, and he was there. And I said, "Oh, you're here to take me into the light." And he said, "No, I'm here to tell you it's not your time. You're going back." And then it was like falling, like I was falling backwards. And then when my soul went back into my body, I could feel the pain. When you're out of your body, you can't feel the pain. So if you've ever been around somebody who's dying and you see them kind of shudder and then their eyes open up, that's their soul going back into their body. Because right before death, the soul will often go back and forth and drag out of the body. Well, it'll go out of the body and in the body and out of the body and in the body. And that's very common. So a lot of times you'll see people shudder, and that's what's happening, because when the soul goes back into the body, you feel the pain. And the pain with that blood infection was so horrible, and I don't take pain medicine. That was the only way I could tell if the antibiotics were working or not. So I never took any pain medicine, but it made childbirth look like a stub toe. I mean, it was, and childbirth is pretty horrible. And it was just like my hair hurt, like everything hurt. And it was just awful. And I was laying in bed and praying that I wouldn't die. And I really, one of the reasons I'm here is that some strangers helped me. One of my therapists kept saying, "You have the same patterns as this woman who died from a blood infection," and she had an IV port. And she kept telling me this, and she said she was still in touch with the husband. And it was the week of Labor Day, and I had turned gray, and all my hair had fallen out, and my guts were falling out. Like I didn't have enough energy to even hold my guts in. And I called her and I said, "Would you please try and get a hold of this man?" And she did. She called him, and this was on a Tuesday, and he said, "I'm out of town until Friday, and I'll get the name of it then." And she said, "I don't think my patient's going to last that long." And so he called his son, and the son went over to the house and pulled the mom's medical records and got us the name of the blood infection. And then they got me on the right antibiotics, and that saved my life. And I've written them a thank you letter. However, I've never met them. So I really part of the reason I'm here is because of the kindness of strangers.
And so what protocol did you do? How did you help yourself?
Well, it's a lot of things, and a lot of it, I can only explain it by saying that I had God moments where I got insight that, I can't even explain how I found the information. Just, like in 2007 is one of the things, and I bought an energetic device to treat my daughter and me. And mainly I bought it for her because she was so young. I didn't want her on all of these medications and doing, the IVs like I was doing. So I bought this device, and I would treat her for 3 days and treat me for 3 days. And then I'd rest on the 7th day. And so then I started testing people who were we called it the IV room. And it was all these people with Lyme disease getting IVs. And I started seeing this pattern of tuberculosis. But when they tested people, it wasn't active tuberculosis, and it was a microbacterium and a mutation. And so because it was a mutation, I thought it was something that came in through like the immunization shot. And so it was really an experiment, but I agreed to do a 6-week protocol of tuberculosis medication. It was called streptomycin. And I did a 0.5 cc twice a week of that. It was a shot. And
So how did you get the doctor to agree to that? Why did you try that?
well, we just did. I don't remember the exact conversations, but I mean, at that point, when you're trying not to die, you do stuff.
Gotcha.
And so the die-off was so bad that I actually smelled like a rotting animal. It was horrific. And I was still dowsing at the time, the die-off from the pathogen. So when these pathogens die, they release neurotoxins, and you only have really 4 main pathways for getting rid of toxins. So you've got your liver, your kidneys, your lymphatic system, and your skin. And so when anybody that's gone through Lyme treatments has gone, experiences what's called Herxheimer's reactions, which is really your body's reaction to a toxic overload. So Lyme disease releases neurotoxins on a regular basis when it's living, but when it dies, it pukes it out. And so the toxin level is extremely high. And if your detox system is already clogged, then it's coming out however it can. So it was coming out through my sweat, and I was dancing. We were doing a cha-cha routine, and actually one of my doctors was my dance partner. And every time I raised my hand, I'd be like, I am so sorry, because it smelled so bad. And but I was significantly better after that. Like the infection level came way down. And what we thought at the time was that the Lyme was feeding off of the mycotoxins. And so that was in 2007. And the first thing that I've read about that's related to it, I was actually in the middle of writing my book, and the CDC and NIH released a report saying that humans could contract tuberculosis from deer. And that was in 2019. So 12 years later, it was released publicly that that's one of the things that can happen. So it's actually a co-infection, and it's very common. So that's one of the things that happened. And so I almost died at the beginning of September. And from that point, it took about 6 weeks before I could even walk across a room. And the first time I physically went into the doctor's office, and it was very busy. There was a ton of people in his waiting room, and he walked by and saw me standing there, and he came running over, and he's jumping up and down. I could barely stand still, but he's jumping up and down going, "You're alive, you're alive. I didn't think you'd live." And all these people were staring at us, and we're like crying and carrying on. And he was the greatest cheerleader, and we'd have all of these very intense conversations. And he said, when we figure this out, it's going to be something simple. And we just have to figure it out. So we just keep digging. And so, I was gaining strength, and my daughter went through a milder prescription for tuberculosis, but she was doing better as well. And then at Christmas time, I'm a health food nut. So, I do detoxes. I've been doing that since I was in my 20s. And so over Christmas, I said, well, we're going to do these detoxes and get all this medication out of our bodies. And it was a Green's first detox. And we both became very, very sick and went back to the doctor, and he said, your blood infection is back. And I freaked out. And so he was on the phone with the pharmacist, and I was sitting at his desk reading the research material about the blood infection. There wasn't even a testing facility in the United States for the blood infection that I had. The man who gave us the name of it, they had sent his wife's blood over to France and got the name of it there because it was not on record here in the United States. And we found out that the infection came in through a contaminated IV bag from China. It's very common over there. It's a waterborne infection that a lot of the people get in the rice paddies where they got a cut on their foot or whatever, and they're walking around, they're very wet. And so people die from it all the time over there, but it really hadn't reached the United States until in those years. I don't know if you remember, but there was a big hurricane that went through Haiti, and 5 IV bag manufacturers were on that island, and they were shut down. And so the medical community started buying IV bags from China. China, and that's how the infection got to the United States. So, the knowledge of it here was almost non-existent. So I was reading the research material about it, and I got to the point where it said it had a biofilm, and I knew in my gut that that was the key. And I said to the doctor, I'm like, this has a biofilm. I was like, this is it. This is the common thing that it has with Lyme disease, because Elizabeth got the Lyme back and I got the Lyme and the blood infection back. And what we figured out was that the enzymes from the plants and fruits in this Greens First cleanse were dissolving the biofilm. So we did a whole protocol and we rotated through various enzymes. And about 6 weeks later, my daughter was Lyme-free. My infection was, much worse, especially with it being layered with the blood infection. So it took longer for me to become disease-free, but we've both been disease-free since 2009. And
what did you do to get rid of the biofilm? I don't quite understand. What was the protocol to that?
The enzymes, we rotated through a lot of different enzymes, and the enzymes break down the biofilm. And this is documented in the medical community now. It was brand new back then that all of these chronic illnesses and pathogens have a biofilm. COVID had a biofilm.
As long as a biofilm to protect itself under certain adversarial conditions.
Yeah, especially when they're bioengineered infections. Lyme disease was first diagnosed in the United States around a federal laboratory in Lyme, Connecticut. And it's designed to take people out. It doesn't work as fast as, like COVID did. However, before COVID, Lyme disease was the fastest growing epidemic in 6 continents. And it was buried. In fact, the same month that I was diagnosed, which was October 2006, the NIH released a report saying latent chronic Lyme don't exist. And then the Connecticut Attorney General took them to court because it was written by 4 doctors who had never treated later chronic Lyme disease. And the Attorney General won the case and the report was thrown out. And then it was reintroduced, basically the same report, almost word for word, right before the Healthcare Act passed in 2010. And it was so that it wouldn't be covered by the medical insurance. So there's very little covered by medical insurance that people with Lyme disease have to go through. So a lot of people end up either, financially destroyed or they can't afford the treatment.
All right, so the enzymes cleared you. How long did it take?
It probably took until about April. The Lyme was gone. It was the blood infection that I was still dealing with because it's very, very aggressive.
What did you do for the blood infection?
Said,
the enzymes got rid of the Lyme, so hopefully you were better off. Then what did you do to finish everything off already?
It was just being on the appropriate antibiotics for the blood infection that whole time. So it just took longer to get rid of the blood infection. I mean, it's got a 3% survival rate, so that tells you right there how aggressive it is.
Do you already have the particular enzymes in your book, or how are people supposed to know about them?
Well, the enzymes it's really individualized. With working with people over the last few years, like I have, and I'm constantly monitoring my clients in that phase of their healing, which is actually the second phase that I do. The first phase, I do a lot of detoxing and building the immune system up, building the body's strength up, because the toxins are usually clogging everything up before they ever come to me. So we have to get that cleaned up so that they don't get overloaded, and build their immune system up, get rid of the opportunistic infections like viruses and parasites and all of the things that are stealing energy from the body. And those all bring down the body's ability to handle the main pathogen. So I call them opportunistic infections because as your immune system becomes weaker, they start taking off. And then you have all of these different things going on at the same time. So it's very devastating to the body to have something like that happen. So the first phase is detoxing and building up the body's strength and immune system. And then the second phase is when we do the enzyme protocol with the antibiotic to kill the pathogens. And prior to even starting that, we have to assess like if they've ever had any other infections. Like if somebody has had some kind of sepsis in the past, we have to have antibiotics for all of these different things ready to go because everything comes out of the biofilm. It's not just Lyme, it's whatever they've ever had. comes out of the biofilm. And so we have to do a lot of preparing to get to that point. And then it's a moving target. So what I've figured out is that the symptoms are based on where the biofilm grows, and it's not the same in everybody.
Where are some places, for example?
For example, if it's growing around your nerves or in your extremities, like I had the neuropathy in my hands and feet, that's where it was growing for me. I also had tinnitus in my ears for several years, and the biofilm was in my ears. You get foggy thinking, so that's biofilm in your brain. And like with your connective tissue, biofilm grows on the connective tissue, and people are often misdiagnosed with fibromyalgia. And that can be biofilm on the connective tissue where it doesn't allow the muscles to move back and forth. And you do have nerves in your connective tissue, so it becomes very stiff, and then nothing can move right, and so it becomes painful. So as the biofilm goes away, these symptoms start going away. Like I do a lot of work in Washington, writing education laws about student loans and federal regulations. And I was in Washington one day, and I hadn't felt my feet in about 5 years. And I'd been up on Capitol Hill all day, and we were walking to a restaurant. I was with a group of my friends, and I said, gosh, my feet hurt. And then I freaked out, and I'm like, oh my God, my feet hurt. I'm like jumping for joy, and everybody's going, what is wrong with you? I was like, you don't understand. I haven't felt my feet in years, but they hurt like normal. And, that was so exciting. And, the same thing with the migraine. I had a migraine for years. And one day I was in my office, and I was looking out the window thinking, just spending time thinking about something, and the blinds were open. And then I was like, wait a minute, I'm looking into the sunlight and I'm not reacting to it. And then I got my hearing back. And so all of these things came back as the body was healing. And the only thing, they told me at one point they didn't know if my organs would ever work right again because of, I was so close to dying and everything was shutting down. And the only thing that I have left that doesn't work perfectly now is my thyroid. However, I'm on about a third of the medication that I used to be on. But that's the only, and I'm 63 years old. And so that's the only.
All this way, you figured all this out. That's great.
Yeah. And the greatest joy was seeing my daughter, heal. And in May of that year, so she came home in February, and that was about 6 weeks after we figured out the biofilm. And she said, Mommy, it's the best Monday of my life. And I said, why, honey? And she said, because I'm not tired. And that was the first time in her life that she said that. And then in May, we had the gymnastics show, and they did a handstand contest, and my daughter won. And her coach, the gym was packed with all the parents and kids. And she said, can I tell Elizabeth's story? And I said, yes. And she said, this is much more than just a handstand contest for this little girl. And she said she's been in my class for years and had Lyme disease and used to have to lay down in between each event. And so this is a very special moment that makes me cry.
No, that's
a very
really cool.
special moment that, she had her strength for the first time in her life. And that's why I do what I do. And I still have my student loan busy. I'm like crazy busy. It's absolutely insane right now. But I take on clients as I have time. And getting those phone calls from people where, they've been sick for 30. I have one gal that's been sick for 30 years, and she's out hiking with her kids now. And she said, I just had my first normal period in 7 years. I have a minister that I work with that called me one day, and she said, and she was about 3 weeks into my protocol. And she said, I did a wedding this weekend and I was standing all day. It didn't wipe me out. And she said, I even danced. And, we're both crying, because she hadn't done that in years. I have people that have been on disability. A dear friend I grew up with, who's a complete badass, and she'd been on disability for 8 years. And in about 6 months, she was going to aerobics class, and now she coaches. And it's hard to explain the joy that I get out of seeing people get their lives back, because they start losing hope when you're sick for that long. It's hard to be positive, and you lose a lot of your support network. You lose a lot of friends. There's a very, very high rate of divorce because, the people get tired of hearing that you don't feel good. And it's also very common that the person with Lyme disease hears over and over, well, you look fine. Because on the outside, you look fine and you're dying inside.
Yeah, I don't know. That's horrible. And then I've had thyroid cancer, but that's nothing compared to what you went through. Still, it feels weird. People are laughing, having a good time around you, just normal. They don't know. And then you're sitting there thinking you're going to die, or like much further along with it. And, I wonder if you wonder, like, how could they be happy? Or it just creates like a weird feeling inside yourself to know that your reality is very different from everyone around you,
Yeah. And, people become dependent, like a lot of the people in the Lyme group that, when I've gone in and said I healed myself, and, some of them get really mean and they're like, there is no cure. Stop saying that. You're misleading people. You're trying to steal from them. And it's like, no, I really am better. And I really do want you to be better.
You mean like other Lyme sufferers or who?
Yeah, they're people with Lyme disease, and they've been told for so long that there's no cure that they believe that. And and it's hard to pull some, not all. Some people will see it, but they have to be ready to heal. And one of the things that I say that's very difficult to say, and even more difficult to hear, is, are you more committed to the disease than you are to healing? Because if you're committed to the disease, then you're never going to heal. There is
an issue that would make someone, I can see that would make someone very angry at first, and then they have to say, wait a minute, Steady's trying to help me, listen to her, chill out for a second.
Yeah. And a very large percentage of people who have Lyme and cancer is very similar, not in how the pathogen works, but although cancer also has a biofilm, but the emotional component of it. And I have this talk with people all the time, and I ask every client I have this question. If you break the word Lyme into two, it's lie and me. So what lie am I telling me that's prohibiting me from getting well? And a lot of times it goes back to these abusive backgrounds that people have, where they don't believe they deserve happiness, or they don't believe they deserve to have their health. And so there's this emotional component that they have to work through, because if your head's not in the right place, you're never going to heal from something like that. And you've been through something similar. And having that determination, for me, my daughter was 5 when I was diagnosed, and failure was not an option. Failure was not an option when I had the blood infection. I was not going to leave my daughter behind. And, that puts you in a completely different place for advocating for yourself, which is really important, because nobody else is going to do it for you. You have to do it for yourself. And that's a journey. And, if you don't believe that you deserve to have a great life, then you have to work on that internally.
You really keep matches around so you can blow up people's gaslighting.
Yeah. So, I had these God moments through it. And one of the things that I'd like to share is a couple of years ago. So, many years after we healed, I went to Tony Robbins' Date with Destiny. And it was not the first time that I went. I was a plat partner for years. And there was something different about that one. And it was how I opened up in this meditation. And he does everything from like it's your first time there. So he said, go back to your first memory. And we were going into this meditation. And I've done so much work on what my parents did to me. And, it was severely abusive, and my brother died, and like every bone in my back's been broken. Like it was bad. And I know that, I've had an attitude for a very long time that those experiences are what drove my success in life. Like I was an insane skier because I would go up on the mountain and take my anger out on the mountain. And that ended up being, driving me to be a world-class skier.
My wife's parents were very abusive too, and she said to me, she goes, I'm surprised that I didn't turn into a serial killer and all that,
What I tell people is the adversities in your life can either be an excuse for your behavior or a reason for making a change. And, I decided to make a change. Like I started this business with the preventing student loans, but I've been an advocate in Washington. I've never been paid for the work I do in Washington. I do it voluntarily, and I go there and I stand up for the students. And it's because education was the way that I got out of my abusive situation. And it's the vehicle for making dreams come true. My business is 35 years old. It'll be 36 years old in December. And I've worked with over 3 million borrowers through my businesses over the years, but I've been writing higher education laws since 1988 and federal regulations around that. So I've affected almost 40 years of college students. And that all came from the pain that I went through as a child. And so I went into this meditation and I thought, I've done all this work on my parents and I think I'm good there. And I'm just going to open up to whatever comes in. And God came in and he showed me how much it hurt him to allow me to go through the pain that I had to go through, both in my childhood and with Lyme disease and nearly dying. And he said, I had to let you go through this so that you would have the experience to fulfill your purpose in life. But it wasn't easy to watch me go through it. Or it wasn't easy to.
And it was a message from the Lord. Right?
Like a conversation I was having with God. I have conversations with him all the time, because praying shouldn't be a one-way street. Like if you're going to be asking for things, you have to also listen, in my opinion, but it's
So praying shouldn't be like leaving God a voicemail.
Yeah, exactly. Because he a lot of times we think we know what's best for us and we have no idea what's best for us, So I have learned over the years to just open up and say, whatever's not 100% God's light and love, be removed from my life and show me the way. And it's much easier that way. Life doesn't have as many challenges when you pray like that because he's just guiding us. And
That's great.
instead of fighting us. And so, when he showed me that it was actually painful to him to have to allow me to go through the level of pain that I've gone through in my life, but he said it was all so that you could fulfill your purpose here. And that's to help all of these people, and education is still a passion for me, and helping people get over chronic diseases is my other passion. And, I don't want a patient for life. I want a friend for life. And that's what I end up being with the people who I work with. I absolutely adore. And we're texting and on the phone all the time and celebrating wins. And it's just a wonderful thing. And, so I want to get the word out there as much as possible. There is a cure. One of the co-infections is called babesia, and that's actually, in my experience, that's the one that takes the longest to heal, like the Lyme is gone in a lot of cases way before the babesia is. But on average now, I have it down to 4 to 6 months. And
oh, wow. And I guess, that seems like a long time, but I guess not when nothing works otherwise.
Well, when you're talking to people that have been sick for 30 years, 10 years, 20 years.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
4 to 6 months is nothing. And it happens very quickly, but they have to be as dedicated to it as I am. Because, it's one of those things where it's like when it moves and some other life form comes out or it mutates or something. And in the scans, I use the energetic devices that scan, and it scans everything. So I look for the patterns so that I know how to prioritize things. And it's not the same for everybody. Like I can't say if everybody does A, B, and C, it gets rid of it. It's not like that because there's, their medical history. It mutates into different life forms and it's not like it goes from A to B to C to D. It can be all over the place when it's mutating. The pathogen will do whatever it can to stay alive. And so we have to outsmart it.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's like the tools are the same, but you don't use them in the same order, if that makes sense.
Well, Mary Lyn, how can people get in contact with you if they're fighting some terrible condition? What's the best way for them to start to learn from you? Should they read your book first and then contact you? Or
the book helps. It's available on Amazon. There's several books called Over My Dead Body, so you have to put my name in there too, Lyn Hammer. I have figured out a lot since I wrote that book, and but that gives you the basics of how what I did with me and my daughter. I've got a website called Champion for Life. It's championforlife.com. I'm on Facebook. I'm in Instagram under Hammer Time. It's HMR_TYM is my call on Instagram. And I'm in Facebook under Champion for Life. Oh, actually, Facebook and Instagram's Champion for Life. And I've got other social medias also, but that's usually the ones that people identify with. And then I've got my program's called the Lyme Crusher. So I also have a web page for that and social media groups for that. And we've got a support group. And and the support group is really about educating people and empowering people. It's really, a lot of the Lyme groups are almost like victim mentality. And I'm not saying that to be mean. However, that's not what we're about. We're about empowering people.
Cool. I just ordered it. I think my wife would really be interested in reading it. So yeah, I just ordered it off Amazon. It's like a person laying down and their soul come out of them. Yeah. I was even if it goes, but it's not. Yeah.
No, there's pictures of my brother David that was in the tunnel of light. He's in there. I talk about that story, and my daughter's in there.
Did it help you to have, by the way, these near-death experiences? I guess you probably don't feel death anymore. Or do you?
I have very strong intuitive abilities. I've always had them, probably because my brother was chatting with me since I was a baby. He was really my protector, and he would talk to me when my dad was feeding me and, doing other horrible things. And he would say, you're strong, you can make it through this. And right before I wrote the book, I had asked for years, why did you leave me? And he finally answered. And, I said, why did you leave me? And he said, because I could protect you more from heaven than I could on earth. And with the minute he said it, I knew it was true, because I don't know if I would have made it through some of the things that I went through if he wasn't there encouraging me, or, standing in the tunnel of light saying, it's not your time, you're going back. I have felt him my whole life. And a lot of the things that I do, it's really hard to explain. I pray before I do everything. And it's really not me healing people. It's really God healing people. I'm just the conduit. And so whatever that I get through prayer is what I apply. And, not everything is for everybody. And it doesn't matter, it's not like I only work with people who are Christians. It doesn't matter to me as long as somebody wants to heal. I don't care what somebody's sexual orientation is. I don't care what nationality they are, what color they are. I don't care about any of that stuff. A soul looks like a soul no matter who it comes from. And so, yeah, it's just, you just got to give love to people, and people really need a lot of love when they're that sick.
Well, excellent. Well, Mary Lyn, thank you so much for coming and, sharing really personal stuff and just being a person. I really appreciate you coming on this podcast and being who you are. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.